Hello and welcome to episode 19 of Evidence for Belief, a series which examines the evidence for the existence of God. In this episode, we're going to move on from the realms of science and history to examine evidence of a much more personal and intimate nature, existential evidence. And by this I'm referring to the personal experience of God in one's own life. Now, of course, in discussing this, we're no longer dealing with verifiable empirical evidence. But as I'll explain shortly, that doesn't mean that this category of evidence should be completely discounted. But let me start by recounting an experience I once had of God's miraculous power. It was Christmas holidays 1985. I was about to commence my fourth and final year of my Bachelor of Theology degree. My wife and I were on holidays on the central coast of New South Wales, and it was the last day before we headed back home for me to recommence my studies. It was a beautiful sunny day and we went to the beach for the morning. Now, the northern end of the beach, where the lifeguards were patrolling, was very crowded with swimmers, body surfers and board riders all vying for a share of the waves. But at the southern end of the beach, about 900 metres away, which is this photograph here, there was literally no one. Now, not wanting to contest the waves with a zillion other people, I left my wife at the patrolled end of the beach and I jogged down to the southern end with my board. I spent about an hour in the surf enjoying a really nice little surf break, which I literally had all to myself. But then disaster struck. I wiped out badly and my board smashed violently into my leg. Immediately, I knew I was in trouble. The pain was excruciating, shooting up from my leg to the very top of my head and enveloping my entire body. I was instantly sure I'd broken my leg. I was in so much pain, in fact, that I couldn't move and I couldn't even get back onto my board. All I could do was cling onto the board and let the whitewash of the next few waves gradually wash me into shore. When I finally reached the shallows, I managed to reach the dry land by shuffling myself backwards out of the water while sitting on my bottom and trailing my injured leg behind me. When I finally reached dry sand, I looked down at my leg and there was a large purple swelling on my shin where the board had smashed into me, and the leg was looking strangely distorted at that place. The pain was intense, and having broken a number of other bones over the years from sporting injuries, I was convinced. I knew that my leg was broken. I was also sure there was no way I was going to be able to get back to the northern end of the beach where everyone else was, because I couldn't bear to even put my foot to the ground. I was completely isolated at the southern end of the beach. The nearest people were nearly a kilometre away. I knew I couldn't possibly hop for a kilometre with or without carrying a surfboard, so I decided to sit on the sand and hope that someone would eventually come along to help me. Now, I have to confess that at first I was really angry with myself and incredibly frustrated because I knew I was facing many weeks with my leg in plaster. I wouldn't be able to run as I did every day. I wouldn't be able to ride my bike. I would have lots of trouble at college because all my lecture rooms were on the second floor and there were no lifts in the building. After a while, I began to feel convicted about my anger and my frustration. I realised that it was pointless being angry about something that I couldn't change and that would only be a temporary nuisance. I also realised that I had very little to complain about compared to many other people in the world who endure terrible hardship every day of their lives. And so as I sat there on the beach in great pain, I asked God to forgive me for my attitude. And I began to think of all the blessings I should be thanking God for instead of whinging about a broken bone that would soon be fixed. As I reflected on these things, a simple worship song came to mind, and there on that lonely stretch of beach, I started to sing it. I figured I was going to be waiting for quite a while before someone came along who could help me, and so I ended up singing several worship songs. But after a while, it suddenly dawned on me that my leg wasn't hurting anymore. I looked down at it. The huge, ugly purple swelling was completely gone. I thought to myself, well, maybe I'm looking at the wrong leg. I glanced at the other leg. No, No, I was definitely looking at the correct leg. I looked back at the injured leg and there was absolutely no sign of any injury. I poked and prodded the area where the injury had been. No pain. Feeling absolutely stunned, I stood up. Now initially I was standing only on my uninjured leg and holding my injured leg off the ground. And then I tentatively placed that foot to the ground, ever so gently. No pain. I placed all my weight on my injured leg. No pain. I started jumping up and down on that leg, trying to find any vestige of pain. None. Still feeling completely stunned, I picked up my board and I literally ran all the way back to my wife. When I arrived there, she was lying on her towel, having just come out of the water. And I stood over her, panting after my run, trying to think of how to explain what had just happened to me. In what I would later come to regard as the understatement of a lifetime, I simply said, "I think I've just been healed." Now, you don't know me. For all you know, I could be just another religious nutter with a self-deluded story of a miracle. After all, there are lots of nutters out there who are convinced of all sorts of things. But the thing about self-delusion, however, is that it usually occurs when there is a pre-existing expectation of something. You want something so badly, you want to believe that something will happen, that you convince yourself that it actually has happened. I once met a man, for example, who claimed he'd been healed of a cold. Yet he was still coughing and wheezing and spluttering and his nose was running and he looked terrible. But according to him, he'd been healed. He was self-deluded and quite frankly, he was in denial of his ongoing sickness. In my case, however, I had no expectation of being healed. In fact, quite the contrary. My healing took me completely by surprise. So much so that it took me a while to be convinced that it had actually happened. It took several minutes of poking and prodding and jumping before I finally became convinced that something miraculous had occurred. If someone had been able to see me jumping up and down on the sand as I was testing my leg, they would have thought I'd lost the plot. Now, this is certainly my most spectacular miracle, but it's by no means the only one. I experience God's intervention in my life on a regular basis, often in much more mundane ways. I regularly experience His peace in times of difficulty, His guidance in times of uncertainty, and His provision in times of need. Allow me to briefly give you another example. In 2018, after publishing 3 books on theology and philosophy, I was midway through writing my first science fiction novel. I was enjoying writing the novel and I felt that it was a good story, particularly as it subtly and sensitively, I think, portrayed a Christian worldview, while still offering readers what I believed was a cracking yarn. But partway through the novel, I began to have doubts. Was writing a fiction novel too frivolous? Did God want me to be writing more serious books? Was I being self-indulgent? In fact, I became so plagued with doubts that I stopped writing. I prayed about the issue for several days, but no bolt from the blue hit me. And then one morning I sat at my desk and prayed very specifically, asking God to make it abundantly clear whether He wanted me to continue writing the novel. I promised God that if He asked me to lay it aside, I would do that. About an hour later, I received a curious email. It was from a teacher at a local Christian high school, where I had previously taught biblical studies and studies of religion for 15 years. She told me that she had set an assignment for her gifted students, asking them to research the scientific challenges facing mankind in seeking to travel the vast distances to other solar systems and possibly colonise other planets. Her students needed to describe each of the challenges and evaluate the various proposed future technologies that are currently being researched in order to overcome those challenges of spaceflight and interstellar settlement and colonisation of another planet. At the end of her lengthy email explanation of the student's assignment task, the teacher then asked me if I would be interested in coming and speaking to her class about these issues, or, at the very least, did I have any helpful information that I could send to her students. Now, I was absolutely staggered by her email for several reasons. Firstly, I'd always been a Bible teacher while at that school. I'd never taught science or anything remotely connected with cosmology or space travel, although I think I had given a very brief staff devotional many years previously about the wonders of the universe. Secondly, the challenges of spaceflight and the colonisation of exoplanets was exactly the topic of my science fiction novel. In fact, I had spent many hours researching exactly those issues in order to start writing the novel. Thirdly, the teacher who sent me the email could not have had any idea that I was writing such a novel because I had told no one at that stage. And fourthly and finally, the timing of her email was incredible. It arrived just an hour after praying for a clear sign from God. In fact, I can tell you that in my 60 plus years of life, I have never received an invitation to speak about the challenges of interstellar space travel except on the very day when I asked God to confirm if He wanted me to continue writing my novel about interstellar space travel. The statistical improbability of this coincidence must be staggeringly high. One day out of however many hundreds of thousands of my lifetime, the very day that I needed God's guidance. As I reflected on the extraordinary timing of this email, I concluded that God had answered my prayer, that He was telling me that He was happy for me to continue writing the novel, which I, by the way, finished and published soon after, along with eventually a further 7 fiction novels. Now, at the risk of boring you to tears, allow me to give you one further example of God's intervention in my life. One weekend in 2002, my wife and I and our 2 kids were staying for a few days with my parents at Foster, Australia. Late one afternoon, my young daughter suddenly realised that her watch was missing. She remembered taking it off while we were at the beach earlier that day. She had placed it in her towel when she went for a swim, but couldn't remember seeing it after that. We concluded that it must have fallen out onto the sand when she unwrapped the towel to dry herself. Now, the watch wasn't very valuable, but it had great sentimental value to my daughter, and she was extremely upset. So we got in the car, we immediately rushed back to the beach, which was only 5 minutes away. This is the photograph of the spot. But when we got there, the sun was setting and the beach was completely deserted. And I mean completely, not a single person left on the beach. The lifeguards had long since packed up and left, and there was literally no one there. We stood around for a few minutes trying to gauge roughly where our towels had been, but it was impossible to tell without the lifeguard flags with which to orient ourselves. So we ended up standing in the middle of a vast stretch of beach, staring hopelessly at the sand around us. And I remember saying to my wife, "It's hopeless. We'll never find it." My wife, however, refused to give up. She said, "Let's pray and ask God to help us." Well, I remember thinking, I'm sure God has much more important issues to be dealing with than finding a young girl's watch. But I didn't dare say it aloud. Not wanting to seem unspiritual, I agreed to lead our family in a brief prayer. We held hands, and I simply asked God if He would help us find the watch. Now, I have to be totally honest with you at this point. I did not believe that God was going to answer that prayer. Even as I prayed, I was already starting to formulate in my mind a logical, reasonable explanation to give to my wife and particularly to my children as we drove home empty-handed, which I was absolutely sure was about to take place. I would explain to my family that God doesn't always answer our prayers the way we would like. I would tell them that God is much more concerned with the big things in the world and also with transforming us and changing us on the inside than helping us keep track of our little possessions. Well, I was completely unprepared for what happened next. As soon as I finished praying my very brief prayer and we all said amen, my wife bent down, plunged her hand into the sand at her feet and squealed. Now, I thought she'd been bitten by a crab, but she hadn't. She drew her hand out of the sand and held up my daughter's watch. It had been buried under about 10 centimetres or 4 inches of sand. It was literally the first plunge of my wife's hand. In all that vast empty beach, we had somehow come to stand precisely where our towels had been, and even more amazingly, my wife's hand had zeroed in on that watch like a radar-guided missile. To say that I was surprised would be a complete understatement. Now, someone could claim that finding my daughter's watch in that way, on the very first plunge of the hand, was simply a fluke, a product of brute chance. But what kind of fantastically small probability are we talking about here? We had absolutely no idea where our towels had been. For all we knew, we could have been 50 or more metres away from our previous spot on the beach. Now, please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not claiming that God always acts in this way, that he is our celestial vending machine to grant all our wishes and help us find our small items of lost property. As a general rule, God does have much bigger and more important issues to be concerned about. He is not my convenient celestial Find My app. But on this occasion, God apparently had mercy on a small girl who was broken-hearted at the loss of something very precious to her. Now, I could multiply these stories dozens or even hundreds of times, instances from my own life and the life of my family, where we've seen God's gracious, caring, miraculous hand at work. Only very occasionally have they been spectacular miracles, like the healing of my leg. Mostly, in fact nearly always, they've been much more mundane things, the tiny details of everyday life that God mysteriously tweaks when we ask for his guidance or help or strength of some kind. Of course, the problem with testimonies of miracles such as these is that you have no way of corroborating them. In the case of the healing of my leg at the beach, for instance, you weren't there. You didn't see my original injury, you didn't feel the pain, you didn't witness the healing. All you have is my word for it. And for all you know, I could be making up that whole story. I could be making up all these stories. And to be honest, I can't help you with that. I don't have video footage that I can post on social media. I don't go through life with a video camera strapped to my head just in case a miracle happens. And of course, the skepticism of the atheist community regarding testimonies of miracles is given a great deal of oxygen because of the prevalence of fakes and frauds. Sadly, there are people who falsely and deliberately claim miracles. They make up stories of miraculous healings and even set up fraudulent healings at rallies in order to increase their faith and rake in more money. They will have to give an account to God one day for their deceptive practices. But here's the thing. The existence of fakes and frauds does not disprove the existence of the real thing. There are plenty of fake Rolex watches in the marketplace, but that doesn't mean the real thing doesn't exist. In my own life, I regularly experience the very real presence of God as he guides me and strengthens me and provides for my needs. And all I can do is testify to my experience of God's reality. And in doing so, I acknowledge that my testimony does not constitute objective evidence. It is subjective. It is my own experience of God. But we shouldn't dismiss subjective testimony as being unimportant. In a court of law, for example, subjective testimony often makes a valid and significant contribution to the establishment of a verdict. When 2 or more people testify that they saw or heard something, it is considered to be powerful legal evidence, even though there may be no corroborating objective evidence, such as video footage. Now, in the legal case regarding the question of God's existence, not only do we have loads of objective evidence that points to his existence, But we also have the corroborating testimony of billions of ordinary Christians like me who testify to the reality of God's presence in their lives. So all I can do is give my testimony and assure you that I'm not a nutter. I'm not a person who is given to gross exaggeration or who is carried away by emotions and hype. In fact, those of you who know me personally will testify that I am a very logically driven person who analyses everything very carefully and demands unequivocal evidence before believing something. I'm not easily fooled or self-deluded, but I am convinced of the existence of God, not merely because of the observable, measurable evidence of science and the verifiable evidence of history, which we've already examined in this video series, but also at a much more personal level because of my daily experience of God in my life. Beyond the more spectacular interventions that I've shared with you in this episode, I have a very strong sense of God's presence in my life every day in subtle ways. And I'm not the only one. As I said, billions of Christians all over the world will testify to the same thing. Now, if you're not a believer, you probably won't find this area of evidence convincing at all. The typical response of skeptics and atheists to the kind of testimony I've presented in this episode is to point out how easily human beings are fooled into believing they've experienced all kinds of ridiculous things. Atheists would just tell me I'm deluded and that it's all just wishful thinking. Well, maybe that's your response too. If it is, I can't help you with that. All I can do is honestly testify to my own undeniable experience of God in my own life. You know, there's a verse in the Bible that speaks of this personal experience of God, and it invites all people to open themselves up to experience the goodness of God for themselves. It's found in Psalm 34, verse 8. Taste and see that the Lord is good. Notice, please, that it doesn't merely say believe that the Lord is good. It says taste and see that he is good. It invites us to encounter God personally, experientially, to move beyond mere intellectual assent and open our hearts to his life-changing presence. You see, ultimately, evidence-based belief can only take you so far. It can bring you to the point where you may concede that God's existence is more probable than his non-existence. But you'll never reach certainty of faith based on evidence alone. What we all need is to encounter God personally. And for those of us who do, for those who take that step to open themselves to God's presence, to taste and see, as the Bible urges us to do, only then do we reach a surety of faith that surpasses mere intellectual assent. It's the undeniable presence of God in my life as I encounter his goodness daily that makes me absolutely convinced of his reality. And God invites you to encounter him in the same way. He promises this in Jeremiah 29:13. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. And so it's my hope and prayer that you will find God for yourself when you seek him and find him with all your heart. Now, we haven't quite finished this series. There are still a few more important episodes to go. So hang in there just a little longer. In particular, can I urge you not to miss the next episode, which is a staggering story of a miracle of God on a national and international level. I think you'll find the next episode fascinating and compelling. For more information, you can check out my books, which are available on my website, smartfaith.net, where you can also subscribe to my weekly blog. Thanks for watching episode 19. Please check out episode 20, and in the meantime, have a great day.